the Talley family, Talley Vineyards, also their farm, which is pretty fascinating, and a little bit of the history of Arroyo Grande and San Luis Obispo, and where things are going. San Luis Obispo County encompasses Paso Robles, which is really well known for a lot of big, powerful, ripe red wines based increasingly on Rhone varieties, but in the past Zinfandel, Cabernet. Actually, in a lot of ways, some of the most large-scale wines in California, if not the New World. And that's really not the case down in Arroyo Grande. And Talley Vineyards has been leading the way with that since the early 1990s, and are really pioneers of this. So, Brian, welcome, and tell us a little bit about how the Talley family got established there.
Well, Josh, thanks for having me. And, my family's been farming here since 1948. That's when my grandfather started farming in the Arroyo Grande Valley. And, I know that you have a map that I sent over, and not sure at what point we want to show folks a picture of where we are. But, in the meantime, I can describe that. The Arroyo Grande Valley is a small coastal valley on the very southern part of San Luis Obispo County. In fact, it essentially adjoins Santa Barbara County, the Santa Maria River, and one of the coolest growing regions in California, which I didn't really come to understand until we started growing wine grapes here in the early 1980s, and then making estate grown wines in 1986.
And you still have 160 acres or so of vegetables.
Actually, we grow about 1,500 acres.
1,500. I'm sorry. No. I'm thinking 160 acres of vines. Sorry.
Yeah, and about 160 acres of vines. And so, and I tell folks, a lot of people talk about the importance of farming in terms of wine growing. I very much adhere to that philosophy. And I really am a third generation farmer. I get up every morning and spend a little time with my cousin who runs our vegetable farming operations. And before I get over to my office here at the winery and check in on what's going on over here.
Well, I know from firsthand experience, you also rise very early.
I do. My friends on the East Coast, I can usually be their first phone call every day.
Well, you're farmers' hours, right? And farmers and winemakers tend to get going very, very early.
Certainly some do. I'm blessed to work with a guy named Eric Johnson here at Talley Vineyards. He's an early riser too. And so, back in the old days when we were really founding this place with our original winemaker was a guy named Steve Rasmussen. He was more of a rolling at noon kind of guy.
So he's a product of the 70s.
Yes, very much so.
Or the 60s.
Since that time, we've really changed some of our practices. Now virtually all the grapes are harvested at night, which means that they arrive at the winery early in the morning and cool. And so that really benefits those of us who like to rise early and get things done early.
Now, one of the things that's always interested me about your wines, and I was introduced to them by a late mutual friend of ours, Chris Robles,
right,
who was a sommelier at a restaurant Nola in New Orleans, worked with Greg Harrington, also in the Emeralds group at Emeralds. And it was actually one evening in 1995, I think, at Emeralds after hours, which is when they would like to taste. And Chris brought over a bottle of, I want to say it was 1993 Rosemary's Pinot Noir. That would have
been the first vintage actually of Rosemary's Vineyard Pinot Noir.
Right, and it was not distributed in Louisiana at the time. It was given to him by a guest because they had a really serious Burgundy program. Incredibly serious. And he said, "You got to try this." And I did, and I was definitely struck by the elegance, the spiciness, and the life to the wine, which was in 1995. That was uncommon, really, a lot of places in the New World. Period. And did you start out that way, or were you making bigger, richer wines and moved on to the more elegant side?
That's a great question. And what I would say is that originally the house style that Steve Rasmussen and I really developed, celebrated it. I mean, our wines have always been about balance. And so, those original bottlings were actually very similar to the style that we produce to this day, which I would describe as one that's very authentic to the place. So very unmanipulated. Having said that, like a lot of folks in the early 2000s, I got a little caught up in making a little bigger, softer style. And so I would say, our wines from about 2000 till about 2009 were typical of a lot of the wines that were made during that era. 2009 was a very interesting vintage. It was one that ended up getting very hot right at harvest. And I had a feeling at the time that the right decision was to start picking grapes sooner than we actually did. And our winemaker at that time was a woman named Leslie Renaud. And she and I had a real difference of opinion about that, to the point where she decided to leave after that harvest. And as Eric Johnson, who was her assistant, came on board, it was really a great opportunity to push the reset button. And so really from 2010 on, we moved back to what I would describe as the original style of Talley Vineyards, one that really celebrates elegance and balance. And in Rosemary's vineyard, with this very high natural acidity that we achieve, energy in the wine, which, back to our late friend Chris Robles, I think really identified that.
And you got interested in wine working in retail when you were at Berkeley, right?
I did. Yeah. My first job in the wine business was working in a retail wine shop called Curds and Whey, which is on College Avenue. It's actually now, in fact, it transitioned during the time that I was there to a wine shop called Vinous, and it's actually right next door to one of the very best restaurants in Oakland, which is owned by my friend Rich Wood, called Wood Tavern. And yeah, I
was introduced to Wood Tavern by Andy Pay.
Okay,
actually, and it's a fabulous restaurant.
It really is, and it's a place I love to go back to, and sometimes I'll actually taste wine with the guys at Vinous, and tell them the story of my start in the wine business that was 1988 when I started working in the biz.
And were you drawn to a particular side? I mean, what sort of wines were you selling, and do you think that had anything to do with where the Talley wines have gone?
Well, and so at that time, I was just trying to learn about wine. I mean, we had started making wine in our family business really in 1984. Our first commercial releases were in 1986. And, Steve Rasmussen was working for us at that time as a consultant. And I became close to him, and I was really looking for a job. I'd actually been working in a wholesale meat freezer, and he said, "Why don't you go to work in a wine shop?"
So you obviously were a liberal arts major.
I was, yes, indeed. History and economics, double major.
Yeah, that sounds like the necessary background to work in wine retail.
Well, it is, or wine wholesale. I mean, it seems like everybody who's out there selling wine is a liberal arts student. But it was just retail, I think, is such a great opportunity to really be exposed to a broad spectrum of wines from around the world. And I'll never forget the Oregon wine that really just sort of rocked my world. It was a Newts and Erath, 1985. I think it was their vintage select Pinot Noir. And it was just so delicate and beautiful, and it really opened my eyes. And as a young guy, I mean, I was into big wines, you know, but it really informed me about the beauty and the translucence of really, you know, stunning Pinot Noir. So the best Oregon Pinot Noir that I probably had for several years. So.
And so it's kind of, I'd say I'm not really surprised. You and I have talked about this before, but the fact that you come from historically multi-generation vegetable growing, you're obviously used to dealing with raw product, and obviously you can't try. I mean, wine is, of course, probably the most processed product that we can consume in a lot of ways. Waiting for the right time to ripen, picking, crushing, etc. But when you pluck a piece of lettuce right out of the ground, that's pretty direct. And obviously, you grew up with that.
Well, I did, but you know, I was also heavily influenced by my father, who he had also gotten bit by the wine bug when he was in Berkeley, though at that time there was really no California wine industry to speak of. Though having said that, his a close friend of his in his fraternity was Bob Long, whose family was already, you know, making wine and growing grapes up in the Napa Valley. So in any event, my dad, his emphasis was on the quality of farming that leads to the best quality of whatever it is that we could grow. And we had already established a reputation when we started Talley Vineyards as being one of the best vegetable growers in California. And his vision was, okay, we just need to do the same thing with wine. We need to establish ourselves as one of the best producers. And at the end of the day, top quality always sells. That was his mantra.
Well, in your fruit, it's like, well, not a sidetrack at all. I know you continue to sell a little bit of fruit to
about 20%,
but to some really, really serious people like Anthony Yount at Canaro, Paul Otto, Testa
and Raj
Rosa.
Parr.
Okay, Testa Rosa.
Raj Parr is actually going to be our biggest customer this year for his Sandy excuse me.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and you know, when you're working with Raj, that means that we go out and visit the vineyard and shoot some video. That's what we did last time I saw Raj, and then had lunch.
And didn't Jim Clendenin, he had Pinot from Rincon for a number of years.
He did, and he was actually the first person to bottle a Rosemary's Vineyard Pinot Noir, which he did in the very first vintage that we sold any grapes to him, was in 1991. And we ended up in 1993 making our first single vineyard bottlings of both Rosemary's and Rincon. So Jim beat us to the punch in terms of producing a Rosemary's Vineyard bottle.
And you just actually sparked a memory in my overloaded and aging memory bank. Doug Marjoram.
Yes.
The wine casting in Santa Barbara was a huge promoter. And I want to say prior to tasting your wine with Chris, that he was involved very heavily in promoting the wines of Santa Barbara County and also you and that region. He had those barrel offerings, remember those future offerings that he used to do in the newsletter? And you guys featured prominently then, but mostly as suppliers, correct? Not so much as a producer.
Actually, we were featured as a producer. You know, that futures program, I'm not sure what year it actually started.
I would say it was 90. It was early 90s, 92, 93, 94.
Yeah, and I mean, we certainly participated in you know, that whole program. And the other person who was really instrumental, which, you know, I talked to Doug occasionally. In fact, he and I have chatted, it was probably 3 months ago. But the other person who featured very prominently in that was David Russell. And David, actually, unfortunately, I think last time I saw him was working for John Fox at Premier Crew in Oakland.
Oh, that's right.
Which was a rather unfortunate set of. So actually, then David went to work at Woodland Hills Wine Company,
which I believe
down in,
but Premier Crew is probably not a good epitaph on the tombstone of your wine career.
No, though I have to say, when I was in Berkeley, I used to buy wine from him too, and I know that some bad things happened there, but I always got the wine I paid for when I dealt with him. So
You drank well. Let's talk just real quick. Just jump into the wine for a second.
That's a good idea.
Why not? I've got the 17.
As do I.
And I noticed, and I didn't notice when we tasted together last time. I did not notice that it was under Diem.
Right.
Cork.
And this is the first vintage that we moved to Diem. And just to give you a little bit of background on that decision, we have paid dearly for solid cork for a long time now, and I would say that the quality of cork has improved certainly in the last decade, but we're still dealing with cork taint issues. And I just got to the point where I don't think it's fair to the customer to have that happen. And quite frankly, a lot of people don't even really understand TCA and, just normal people. And, what other industry would knowingly, put up a product that, has a defect rate of, potentially 2 to 5% solely based on, the closure that we use, when we know that there are other things that we can do that will mitigate that. And so after doing some research and really looking at a number of folks that I respect, we made the decision to move to Diem. And not only have we eliminated the cork issue, it's more cost effective as well.
Just as the next Chardonnay, which is the 13 Rosemary's, just to give you an idea. Here's the cork on the 13 Rosemary's.
Well, and in that cork, these days, here's mine. It's in a little better condition. Can you see that? Yeah.
Yes. You see, mine has seepage.
Yeah. Mine was in better.
Almost half the way up.
So this is a cork now. This quality of cork would cost about 75 cents.
This particular cork.
That particular cork, right now, 75 to 80 cents. And, the same quality grade of Diem, again, with a virtual guarantee that there will be no TCA, is probably going to be 40 to 45 cents.
Wow. Okay. That's convincing.
Right. And so, we're just getting started with it. The 18s mark our second vintage. And I think the other thing that we have to understand is that, for guys like you and me and people in the trade, we pay a lot of attention to these things. Most people, when you put down a Diem versus a solid, cork in front of them, they don't notice the difference. And, I think that as the industry evolves, we need to be thinking more about where our greatest impact is. And quite frankly, I think that's what's in the quality of, the product.
And I'm actually, this one's actually tasting a lot like what I tried earlier, but it's really leaning heavy on the pear and the melon. You think that's a function of the vintage?
And so which, are you still talking about the 17 or the?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I'll go back to the 13. We were just talking about the cork. Uh-oh. Brian?
Yeah. So again, the 17 is what?
No, we lost you for a second. We had a little satellite bounce, as they used to say.
Oh, maybe it's one of those lightning storms outside there.
What's happening for me?
You know, it's interesting. The 17 vintage in general, and I chose to show and discuss 13s and 17s. I find some similarities in the wines, and yet the vintages could not be more different. 17 was essentially an El Nino vintage. We had about 30 inches of rain. We had very vigorous canopy growth. We were dealing with some botrytis issues, which we got entirely sorted out. But it was a vintage that required, a lot of work, both in the vineyard and in the winery. 13, on the other hand, was basically a drought year. We had 6 inches of rain. We had 0 botrytis. I certainly would have liked more moisture in the soil, but it was about the easiest thing to manage, from the standpoint of, just producing high quality fruit. And yet I think over the long run, the wines have sort of a similar profile in terms of their acidity. And it'll be interesting for me to see how the 17 evolves, over the next, 5 to 7 years.
My bottle of 13 Rosemary's. Oops, sorry. Show it was the 17. How to do this? The 17 Estate and the 13 Rosemary's Vineyard. Which these are your oldest vines? Is that right?
Yeah. So the backbone of the Rosemary's Vineyard is the section that my father planted right in front of my mom's house back in 1988. And so those vines, yeah, okay.
Great. Thanks, Julie.
And so in this picture, and if there was a way for me to, kind of show where things are, if you look in front of the house that is right in the middle of the vineyard, surrounded by the trees, that's my mother's house. She is Rosemary. And directly to the northwest of that, there are some very wide roads. And that's where that's the original planting of Rosemary's Vineyard Chardonnay. And that's where this wine predominantly comes from.
Okay.
So one of the other
it's up high. I've walked through that vineyard with you.
Well, it's basically, all of this is just above sea level. So our elevation here is not great, but that's one of the things that really makes this region so cool from a climatic standpoint, is we're just basically sitting at sea level, and this vineyard is about 7 miles from the ocean. So consequently, we just get a lot of fog and those cool ocean breezes. Today it's about 74 degrees here.
Okay, not bad. Are the vines happy?
Vines are very happy. This is a year where we didn't get quite our normal amount of rainfall, but we did get some nice rain in April, and we're going to have sort of a moderate sized crop. And in general, things are looking good. Starting to get our first signs of veraison, and that means it's time to put our bird netting up, because the birds like to start eating the grapes when they turn color and start to accumulate sugar.
And just jumping onto this 13 Rosemary's, my bottle at least is really, really tight.
Yeah, I noticed the same thing, and it's interesting because this wine over the last 6 months, I think is going through an interesting phase. I would say
it's got some color.
Yeah, mine's pretty pale. I don't know.
Could be my camera.
Right. Mine still has, a very pale and hint of greenish hue to it.
Maybe this is my cork.
Yeah, that's probably the effect of your cork.
Yeah, because these are two definitely different colors.
Yeah.
Well, it's a good ad for Dam.
Well, it is, and I think it's also a reminder that what we're dealing with here is, wine, especially the way that we make it. This is don't want to get too caught up in semantics here, but it's fundamentally an organic product. Like a person, these things evolve over time, and the longer they're in bottle, the more they evolve in sort of different directions. Unfortunately, your cork didn't look so sound, so I think that's why it may be a little bit more advanced than.
Yeah, I was a little concerned when I looked at it, and there's definitely just hold yours up again, because I think that color contrast is.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a huge difference.
Yeah.
Like we have two different wines. Yours actually still has some green in it.
Yeah. Oh, totally. And I will share with you that a couple of weeks ago, my daughter turned 23, and it was a few days after my mom turned 80. And so we decided to celebrate that with a bottle of 1997 Rosemary's Vineyard Chardonnay. Actually, one of our favorite restaurants is Ember in Arroyo Grande. And that 97 still had more green in it than I think your 2013 does. So
yeah, what's weird about it is, and I know that the cork can do weird things, and oxidation can do weird things, because it's very tight and almost dry. But at the same time, there's a honeyed quality that's in sharp contrast to that dryness. So it's a real push-pull. It's not unpleasant, and there's no I don't get TCA, but it strikes me as kind of like what you get with some oxidized wines, even sherry. It's not like sherry, but where you can get richness and dryness and almost a shrill quality. It's interesting. It's I'm guessing it's not what it's supposed to be.
No, and that's interesting, because we've been drinking a lot of these 2013s again over the last 6 months or so, because we feel like at least over the past few months, I felt like this is really at a wonderful point to enjoy. Most bottles aren't showing the level of maturity that you're talking about. But if anything, what I'm noticing, and we also opened one of these for my mom's 80th, it's kind of going into a phase where it's showing a bit more tightness than was the case before. So, just a reminder that, it's a very natural product, and these things go through strange phases.
Well, actually, I think this, cycling back yet again to the closure issue, to me, one of the biggest issues you were talking about non-wine geek, non-obsessive wine drinkers. You think about somebody who goes to a restaurant, orders that wine off the wine list, that bottle,
right,
with that cork, and pays at this stage, a good sum of money for it, and they have it, and they say, it's fine. To me, that's the worst kind of cork.
Right.
It's not full on, shower curtain in your fraternity house, soapy, chlorine-y, nasty TCA. It's advanced, but somebody say, well, it's 7 years old, and they start making excuses for it. Right. But then, just from the looks of the glass, the wine that you had in your glass, that looks like how it's supposed to be. But how would somebody? But how does somebody know that unless they had your bottle?
Well, and again, that is one of the challenges, and why, quite frankly, I wanted to go. Eric made this point to me. I think he had a real eye-opening experience about 2 years ago. He had to open a bunch of bottles.
Come on, Eric Johnson, no, right?
Yeah, Eric Johnson, our winemaker. to decant a bunch of estate Chardonnay. And he wasn't struck so much by the amount of TCA that he encountered. He was struck by the bottle variation. And it got his attention that there was that much variation in the wines. And one thing about the Diam cork is that it's just a much more, and now I'll show a Diam cork versus a very expensive solid piece of cork. You can see all these different sort of striations and inconsistencies in the solid piece of cork, whereas Diam is just a very, very consistent, in terms of its density. And
take a look at the flanging.
Right.
On that, that's the questionable 13 Rosemaries, and
right.
You can see how narrow it is up at the top, and then you see all this staining on the business end, which touches the wine.
Well, and the
And
great
the
thing
deal.
about Talley Vineyards wines is that they all come with a complete unconditional guarantee. The only thing in your case, Josh, is you're going to have to come back here to Arroyo Grande and drink one of these 13s with me, right out of my cellar.
So you can prove it.
Exactly.
So you didn't pour 2017 Chablis into your glass.
No.
Excuse me. I'm allergic to lightning.
Uh-oh.
The Pinot Noir, which
Yes.
I think is how much of your production is Pinot Noir versus Chardonnay?
In terms of Talley Vineyards wines, it would be about a third, 2/3. With our Bishop's Peak line, it gets a little closer. It's still about a third, 2/3 at the end of the day. But I have to say, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Bishop's Peak, really quick, for people who aren't familiar with it. That's
basically
I hate to call it second label. It's second label, or it's another project.
Yeah, it's a companion brand, and it intends to involve a lot of declassified Talley over the years. Some purchased fruit, but back to the question at hand. Historically, we're producing anywhere from a quarter to a third Pinot Noir versus 2/3, 75% Chardonnay. Now, having said that, Pinot Noir was really what put Talley Vineyards on the map.
So do you see that continuing, or do you maybe think about increasing Pinot Noir?
Well, Pinot Noir is in a very interesting phase in the market right now. Unfortunately, there has been a lot of Pinot Noir planted, both in, I think, some fairly high quality sites, places like the Santa Rita Hills and, parts of the coastal parts of Monterey County. But there's also been a lot of Pinot Noir that was planted, quite frankly, grafted in very warm areas, even Lodi, because after Sideways, there was a real explosion in the demand for Pinot Noir. And consequently, we've reached a situation where there's actually an oversupply of Pinot Noir grapes and bulk wine in the market. So Chardonnay has tended to be more consistent. One, it's just got, Chardonnay is the most popular wine in the world, and so it's just got a bigger base of consumption. And it hasn't had the level of oversupply that Pinot Noir has been subjected to.
Would you say that's the case at every end of it, or it seems to me that at the high end, like for the amount of money that people seem to be willing to pay for high quality, small production, elite vineyard, elite producer Pinot Noir is quite a bit higher than Chardonnay.
I would say that is certainly true in California. Yeah.
Whereas by the lower end, and I hate to say it sounds pejorative, but I mean, obviously Chardonnay, an awful lot of it is in the under 20, under 15 price range, where Pinot Noir basically doesn't even exist.
Well, you'd be surprised at how much Pinot Noir is actually being produced in that realm right now.
Is it all Pinot Noir?
No, that's a I tell people all the time, it's so much easier to sell Syrah when it says Pinot Noir on the label.
Yeah, so if you hit the 76%, everything's good.
Exactly. And, people figured out early on, and I mean, that goes back to the old days in Burgundy when people figured out that you could go get, deep red wine from Algeria and beef up, lower grade Burgundy. I mean, people have been doing the same thing, unfortunately, with California Pinot Noir. And, I think that does not help. I don't think it helps the market. I think it creates a false impression of what Pinot Noir should be. And, another thing that my father used to tell me is that poor quality in the market really damages the overall market, because after consumers have a few bad experiences, they just come to the conclusion that, Pinot Noir is bad. And, that's not helpful.
And I think, well, during your retail days and my own, going back 20 years, a shocking number of people who I know should know better still talk about California Pinot Noir, right? Like, it's like, what do you mean? Which is crazy.
You mean California Appalachian Pinot Noir?
California. I don't understand how they could make elegant Pinot Noir in California. It's hot there.
Right.
I still hear this.
Well, yeah. And I mean, and I think that we're only evolving now to a more granular understanding of the differences in these coastal valleys that we're farming, the different soils that we're farming approaches. I mean, all of these things really factor into the kind of the quality of Pinot Noir that we can produce. And, I would argue that the very best producers and the best sites in California can very much rival, the best Pinot Noir in Burgundy.
I mean, I was thinking about your home base. San Luis Obispo County. I look at the coastal vineyards, and the one I always think of is, Spanish Springs. And that has to be one of the coldest. They could probably grow Melon de Bourgogne there, for God's sake, right? I mean, it's ice cold. And I mean, hot days, lots of sun, but the nights there are crazy. And as a result, you get, and they're growing Syrah around that area, and making, Syrahs that are in the 12.5, 12 to 13%, which is alcohol range, which is what co-roti traditionally was.
Right.
I mean, not trying to draw a comparison like, it tastes like co-roti, but, this is Syrah that is not hitting 15, 16%, or even, Grenache, which can hit 17% plus up in Paso. But for a lot of people, they still see California as this one amorphous wine growing region.
Well, and what my job and others like me need to do a better job of is just educating people about the diversity of California. And I was just having a conversation with some folks at lunch today that not only are there are these climatic differences, but again, there are stylistic decisions that people are making about just the kinds of wines that they want to produce. And, I argue that we're in a golden age of California wine, where we have this gamut just right here in San Luis Obispo County. You're right. I mean, you can taste Chardonnay that has acid profile an alcohol profile very similar to Chablis, or you can taste wine from Paso Robles that's 17% alcohol. And the two vineyards might be 60 miles apart.
But they could be on the other side of the world. I mean,
Right.
So on the Pinot subject, 17 estate. Did you use whole clusters in here?
There's a little bit of whole cluster in this wine. We typically retain more whole clusters in our Rincon vineyard vinification. We just tend to see a little bit more lignification of stems in that site. And over the years, I've just really liked what stems do. So when you do taste our Rincon Vineyard single vineyard bottling, that's going to be a wine that's probably going to have about a third whole clusters. And then by the time we get to the estate, which, somewhere about 50% of the cuvee here is represented by Rincon Vineyard. So that overall whole cluster contribution might be about 10%.
It's very spicy.
Right. And, one of the other things about this wine that, there's a little bit of tannin here, there's a little bit of minerality. And, those are characteristics that I've always really enjoyed in Burgundy. I think they allow the wine to pair better with a wider range of foods, especially red meat. And I think there's a lot of California Pinot Noir that's really lacking in structure and a little bit of tannin. And we don't find this wine. I mean, this is very much a product of what we're getting out of the vineyard.
And new oak on this is about 20-25%.
Yeah, in this vintage, between 25 and 30%. And I see that Julia has put up a picture of my mother and I standing together at her other home. So when she's not living in the middle of Rosemary's vineyard, she spends her time up in Sun Valley, Idaho. And that's where the two of us were standing when this picture was taken.
Cool. Well, there's mountains around, just like at home.
Yeah, and that's where my mom is right now, and got a chance to catch up with her just last night, and not sure if I'm going to make it up to Sun Valley this year or not.
Not a lot of travel going on.
No, it's unfortunate. I mean, on the one hand,
and here we are.
Right. Well, yeah, this is the first time, gosh, you and I have known each other for over a decade now and done a lot of tastings. This is the first time we've ever done one like this.
16 years now.
Okay. Hey, there's me and my dog, Dixie Pearl. And we're actually standing out in the middle of, speaking of Talley Farms, that's our berry patch. And, she's, as you can see, she's a good dog. Sometimes she's the only one that pays attention to me. Hey, I'm moving on to the Rosemary's Vineyard Pinot Noir because, since.
I just want to ask one last question on the 17. It's actually, you mentioned tannin and structure. It has, to me, it's put on weight and gained structure since I last tasted it.
Right.
And it's also gone a little bit darker, which doesn't surprise me entirely for the vintage. How much new oak is here? About 20-25%?
About 25 to 30.
Okay. I mean, it's not showing in vanilla, but it's showing in grip and it's showing in structure.
Well, and actually, I think that's basically phenolic contribution from grapes. I mean, one of the characteristics I associate with Rincon Vineyard is this, which has these very clay calcareous soils, is this sort of iron note. And, I think we get a little bit of that in the estate. And the estate is just, it's a wine that I mean, I think this will be great over the next 20 years.
By the way, that is
2017.
estate.
Yes.
And so I've caught up with you on the 13 Rosemaries.
Yeah, and so as is the case with the Rosemary's Vineyard Chardonnay, the backbone of this wine is the other original planting of Rosemary's Vineyard, which occurred in 1987. This is own-rooted Wadensville that my father had planted, essentially on the west side of the driveway that accesses my mother's house. And interestingly, my dad had wanted to plant about 2.5 acres of Pinot Noir and about 5 acres of Chardonnay. Though in 1987, Chardonnay was in such short supply, he couldn't get it. So had to wait a year until he planted the east side of the driveway. And as we started making wine off the vineyard, we liked the Pinot Noir so much better than the Chardonnay that we ended up grafting over half the Chardonnay to Pinot Noir. I was going to graft it all over, but Steve Rasmussen talked me out of it. And that very next year in 1994, we finally made a very successful Rosemary's Vineyard Chardonnay, which became the inaugural release of Rosemary's Vineyard Chardonnay.
I mean, I know it's probably not true that you can smell structure, but I think even just if you look at the color of this wine, it's a 7-year-old Pinot Noir. I mean, it's still Pinot. I mean, it's spicy, it's floral, but it's young.
Yes.
And I haven't tasted it yet. It smells. I haven't tasted it yet, but it is. This is young.
Well, and that's one thing that people often remark about our wines is, how slowly they evolve. And I think what's interesting about this particular wine is that, for Burgundy fans that may be paying attention to this, it maybe started off a bit more like Vin Romanée or Volnay, and now I think has shifted a bit more to Nuit Saint George or Pommard. Definitely a little bit more structured and muscular.
Well, more in that what was called like Pommard, Nuit, Maurice Saint-Denis, Gevrey school,
right?
Rather than the Chambol, Vosne, Volnay school.
Yes.
I mean, this one is dark. It still has a lot of life. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, it's not that black non-Pinot, if you know what I mean. But it is, it's young. I have to rethink my drinking windows.
Well, yeah, and it's sort of interesting because I think that these wines over the past 6 months, that I feel like at least as of today, the window is closing, a little bit on these, and it might be time to go back to. I mean, 2012 was a little bit certainly a more generous vintage, and I remember. Now I had one of those again for my mom's 80th birthday, and that was a wine that got a very, very big score in the Wine Advocate, and so people pay a lot of attention to that. And at one point, I thought that was kind of overripe.
What's the Wine Advocate?
Yeah, I know. But in any event, yeah, I think this wine might be time to put it away for a little while and then come back to it. And
it's got a load of fruit. I'm just a little pleasantly surprised by this backbone that it has. Right. And
well, that's why everybody needs to buy at least 12 bottles of every vintage of my wine so that they can drink one, over the course of every year. And then, for the last 3 or 4, decide if they want to put those away.
I thought you say you buy a case and they should drink a bottle over the course of 12 days. Or 6 days. You want that kind of custom.
Not everybody's a trained professional like you, John.
This is really, really impressive. And I like your assessment about it. It's a darker side, but it's still a vibrant side. You know, I mean, it's
right. Well, and to me, I mean, that's the thing that, you know, I talked about getting to work in a wine shop. Quite frankly, I didn't get to taste much Burgundy there. It was really over the next few years when I got exposed to Jim Clendenin and started learning what he was up to and into that I started drinking, you know, more Burgundy. And in those days, quite frankly, good Burgundy was a lot more affordable. And I was really struck by this amazing balance of wines that could have structure and could have dark color, but then this amazing energy and life to them that I felt like in California was often lacking. That when you saw a wine that might be this color, it would just be sort of heavy and ponderous.
Because with Pinot Noir, I mean, in your era, you're maybe just after. I mean, I'm thinking of people like Josh Jensen. You were not far behind that.
Yeah. So Josh, I'm not sure what his inaugural vintage was. Late 70s.
As far as getting when they became sort of nationally, at least for me on the East Coast, when I saw them, would have been 85, 86, 87 vintage.
Right.
Other than that, we had Chalone and their side project, of course, Acacia. But they were, Chalone was considered a cold climate.
Right.
Right. I mean, Russian River Valley didn't exist. And I've always liked the way things have kind of moved north up there. Chalone started off as the cool place. Then Russian River Valley became the cool place. Then Mendocino, and they keep pushing further and further north. But during your time,
and also closer to the ocean. I mean, that's been the biggest trend that I've seen over the last 20 years is just more and more Pinot Noir in California that's just been planted closer and closer to the ocean. And I mean, you mentioned Spanish Springs a few minutes ago. That vineyard's just a little over a mile from the ocean. And, fortunately, there's a fairly significant hillside there that's really protecting the vineyard from the onslaught of the ocean breeze. That also allows a little bit better chilling in the wintertime. Otherwise, that site would probably be unsuitable for growing wine grapes. It would just be too coastal influenced.
And just have to talk very quickly about a variety that's near and dear to my heart that you're working with now, Syrah.
Yes. So Syrah is, I mean, I like Syrah too, though I have to say after, a few years of slogging it out, trying to sell Syrah in the wholesale market, probably one of the brighter decisions that we made was just to sell it entirely here to people who visit us at the winery so we can put it in their glass. And once they get to taste it, they tend to take some home. And, I would describe Syrah from this area as kind of like Cornas with a little meat on the bone. So not quite as maybe wiry as some of the wines from the Northern Rhone can be, but still with that kind of white pepper and bacon fat and some of those kinds of characteristics that I associate with cool climate Syrah.
So you're not going to be ripping out your Chardonnay to graft it over to Syrah anytime soon.
No. In fact, we've had a debate. The thing that's on the chopping block for us, unfortunately, is Riesling. And my grandfather, who was not a fan of getting into the wine business, told my dad when we started planting wine grapes, plant Riesling. So at least I'll have something decent to drink for lunch. And, I love the Riesling that we make here, but it's proven to be just about the hardest thing there is to sell right now. People, when they visit the winery, just don't want to consider it because they have preconceived notions typically that it's going to be too sweet. And I think for winemakers, they find that it's just too hard to compete with all the great German Riesling that's out there at in some cases, very, very reasonably priced.
But you still do have Riesling vines.
We do, and we're having a debate right now. I've got you mentioned Malone de Bourgogne. We do have one person that would like us to actually plant Aligoté.
I can imagine who that is.
Yeah, that would actually be Mikey Juni from Scar of the Sea. And then we have been thinking about Chenin Blanc, which I love. I love great Chenin Blanc. So that's, or I'm telling people if they can't make up their mind, I'm just going to draft it to Chardonnay because that works great. And that's what people want, So.
Yep, practical farmer.
Well, that at the end of the day, now that I'm, in my 50s, I'm becoming ever more practical and ever more concerned about the bottom line.
Wait till you get to your late 50s.
Oh, well, by then, one of my daughters will probably be here and, really taking the bull by the horns. And maybe I can go back to, maybe I can turn into Randall Graham and, try to grow things in concentric circles that nobody can pronounce.
Well, maybe you will become your grandfather and you'll be the cranky old guy saying, don't tear out that damn Pinot Noir.
Well, I doubt that Pinot Noir really grows well here. And, one thing to share about that, I often hear from people, Pinot Noir has the reputation for being such a difficult wine to produce. And yet over the years, even going back to the first vintage, it's been one of the easiest wines for us to make. It ferments readily. It grows pretty well. I'm not always happy with the yields, but it really thrives in this site. And it just goes to show if you're in the right place and the winery's set up to make it, it's really not that hard to produce.
So I have to touch on one thing, which is a little sensitive, just given where things are. I heard I guess, yesterday. Was it the tastings were shut down? Did that affect you?
Well, our tasting room, we reopened in early June, and the way we did it here, it's all outdoors. Everything is socially distant. People have a long ways between any other guests, and all of our staff is wearing masks, and it's very safe, and we're getting very, very good feedback. We were also the first winery in the county to actually offer tasting. Most other people were just offering bottle service. And I have to say, we did not have to shut down again the way that some other counties did. And we're getting very, very positive feedback from our customers about the experience they have here.
And wholesale?
Wholesale, that's a whole nother story. And
for another time.
Out of time.
so maybe over at Jocko's, over 10-ounce bourbons on the rocks to talk about that. Anyway, Brent, thank you so much. It's great to see you. And never enough time, but it's great that we could touch on all these little aspects, not little aspects, but all these aspects that make Talley. And for all of the people watching this or who will watch it on YouTube or listen to it on all these things that all you young folks do, Vimeo and podcasts, go out and see it. It's a beautiful part of the country, absolutely beautiful part of the country, and cool people. And make sure you go to Jocko's for an amazing steak and lifestyle experience.
Right.
And tell them Brian Talley sent you. Tell them Brian Talley sent you.
That's right. And hopefully they won't throw you out.
No, you get a free drink.
All right. Well,
Thanks
cheers,
again,
my
Brian.
friend, and